So when it comes to structuring your JavaScript, and I'm actually going to remove this out and I'm going to place my JavaScript in here now. And this is just for the purposes of this course because it's just easier to read, so I don't have to flip through several different files, so I can keep everything within that one index.html file. So in this lesson, we're going to cover off JavaScript structure. So within JavaScript, when we defined variables and values, so if I was to define a as 1, and if I define a equals 1. So my question to you is, are these going to be the same? So essentially, what is the value of a? So if I do a lowercase a, I want to find out what the value of it is. Are they actually going to, is this one overriding that one, or are we able to display that out? So one of the tools that I usually use on a regular basis in order to output content for my website is, or when I'm actually doing development work, is console log. And this is a really useful tool, and especially with Chrome, it has a really good web dev tool. And we'll notice that when we're writing out JavaScript, unless we tell it to actually render something out onto the page, we're not going to see what JavaScript is doing. So it can do any number of calculations in the background and so on. So one of the things that I do want to do is I want to use my web dev tools and open up the console. So this is where that console log is sending through that message. And going back to that initial question, what's the value of lowercase a? So lowercase a is going to be 1, as we saw within our console. So we get that output there. When we click on this, we see console log is the one that's outputting that. And the reason for this is that JavaScript is case sensitive. So a is not equal to uppercase A. And this is going to be an important thing to remember when you're writing out your JavaScript, that you do have to be cognizant of the fact that it is case sensitive. So if you have a really long word, and if you have some uppercase letters and lowercase letters, it might actually get confusing. So if you do something like A, B, so these, again, these are going to be different values because of the case sensitivity, and this comes into the idea when you are actually creating your values and your variables that you're going to be using to always to make sure that you do differentiate them and that you don't end up with something like this that could actually get confusing once you have a whole bunch of code and you see Apple AB. Sometimes you can overlook the fact that you're not, the case isn't the same. So try to keep that naming convention there, and it's important to make note of that. So one of the things with JavaScript as well, extra indents, line breaks, spaces, JavaScript ignores all that extra white space. So always try to make sure that your code is more readable. So you can actually do something like this, and it's going to be the same thing as we had before. And sometimes you also want to compress your code. So this is what's called minifying your code, and this helps with load times. And there's a whole bunch of editors online where you can go minify code. So I'll just show you one of those now. I just went to JS compress, and there are a whole ton of these. So I'm going to actually break this out with all of that additional white space. Copy this, and this actually isn't going to work. It's going to throw an error because I changed the variable. But we're also going to talk about that in the upcoming lesson. So here, I believe we just press compress, and we see that it removes out all of that additional white space. So this is a minified file, and this is going to run the same way. It's going to mean the same thing as that previous version. It's just minified. So white space is ignored. It's more for readability that we have that white space in there. And for readability, Brackets has this built-in beautify, so it allows you to reformat your code so it's, again, more readable. Adding in comments in JavaScript, so there's several different ways to add in comments. So if you had one line of comments, And if you have multiple lines of comments, then you could do it this way with slash, asterisk, and then asterisk slash, and everything here is ignored. So everything within here is going to be ignored. And the reason for commenting, it doesn't actually do anything. Nothing gets rendered out in the code. But the reason that we comment, again, this is for readability, for when you come back into your code, maybe 6 months down the line, and you want to make sure that you understand what all of these values are doing. So you might want to do something like apple baby is the number of apples I ate, or something like that. And so this, which might not make sense down the line, 6 months down the line, but if you do have this comment and you open up your code and you're reading through this, you read through your comments and you say, okay, well, this is why I called it apple AB, because it's numbers of apples I've been eating, and so this makes sense that I'm doing whatever calculations I'm doing. Also here, you can add some additional instructions. If you're error checking or if you've done some updates, you can always comment those updates in. Also, one of the other things with JavaScript is to make sure that you've got the semicolons. So semicolons are required at the end of each code statement. So here, when we minified it, it actually commented before we did have the 2 semicolons, and that's because this is now considered one code statement where I'm defining variables. So this is equivalent to doing it this way. It's just a whole lot shorter. And notice here that I've always got these semicolons, and this is for the browser when it's rendering out the JavaScript to understand that, okay, well, this was one piece of code, this is the next, this is the next, and it splits it out with the semicolons. And because this isn't minified, it's readable by the human eye, but it's going to be the same thing when it hits the minifier and everything gets compressed together without removing all of that white space. Then it's actually not going to be readable, and that's where the semicolons completely make sense, because you do need to have these in place. So in the next lesson, we're going to talk more about different types of values. So we saw here that we used variables, and this was a very basic use of variables. And you're going to find that throughout using JavaScript, variables are going to be one of those essential pieces of your coding logic, that variables are really going to save you time, and it's also going to help make that code dynamic. So we're going to be discussing that in the upcoming lesson and a whole lot more.